Hello and welcome to Popular Antiquarian, the podcast about a middle-aged man delving into the strange and forgotten corners of pop culture. That middle-aged man is me, Hieronymus J. Doom, and this episode is another in our long-running series focusing on the films of the Asylum, the mockbuster production company often regarded as the worst movie studio in the world. This episode, we're going all the way back to 2007 and looking at Transmorphers, which was designed to cash in on Michael Bay's first Transformers movie. As a child, there were few things I liked more than Transformers, and as an adult, there's few things I liked less than Michael Bay, a man whose aura is what if an explosion somehow learned to objectify women. Transformers are objectively cool toys. Megatron, a hateful robot that wants to kill everyone, can turn into a gun to better serve that end, which is amazing. Big trucks were awesome even before they could turn into Optimus Prime, and Wheelie will be first up against the wall when the revolution comes, and will not be afforded the luxury of any last words. Cool though the toys undoubtedly are, there was always something odd about trying to turn them into bona fide characters. There's a curious problem with the Transformers in that they look most impressive when there's human stuff around to show off their size and weight, but in most cases the presence of human characters is an aggravating distraction from the robot civil war. If you cut out the humans to focus on the Transformers, then you end up losing that sense of scale and the attendant sense of wonder that's a key part of their appeal. There is a constant tension between these two factors in most Transformers media. The cartoons and comics increasingly solve the problem by sidelining the human cast and not worrying about the scale issue at all. The animated movie was able to regain a sense of wonder by making the ultimate bad guy a literal planet voiced by Orson Welles, and as approaches go, that is not too shabby. I have a real soft spot for that movie, and I've watched it more times as an adult than I'm comfortable admitting. I have no such affection for Michael Bay's Transformers movies, or indeed for any of his movies after The Rock, which I do remember somewhat fondly, probably because I saw it as a teenager and have wisely not revisited it to check if it still holds up. I remember being excited by the idea of a live-action Transformers movie right up until I saw the first trailer, at which point a little bit of my childhood withered and died. I hated the way the robots looked, I hated the way they transformed, and I hated that Shia LaBeouf was in it. I rewatched the trailer for this podcast and I still hate it. I hate everything about it, except the way that Bay successfully creates a sense of scale for the action. That is genuinely impressive. I did not watch Transformers in 2007 because I didn't think it would be very good, which is almost unfathomable to me in 2025 when I mostly watch movies that I don't think will be very good. I feel like history has broadly been on my side of the fence, with the films raking in vast sums of cash, but largely vanishing from the cultural zeitgeist quite rapidly, in a way that the animated movie kind of hasn't. I did see Transformers 3, but only so I could be rude about Michael Bay on a website I was writing for at the time. I absolutely hated everything about that movie, but fortunately I was able to drink heavily enough to blot most of the actual film from my mind. I don't think I could tell you the plot of it at gunpoint by this point. At some stage I'm going to have to do a deep dive into the Transformers comics written by Simon Furman for Marvel, because it's a great example of how a good storyteller can flourish within the unlikely framework of a comic intended to promote a toy line to small children. But that's something for another day. For now, we're concerned with what kind of movie the Asylum are going to cobble together in their efforts to imitate Transformers. The answer is, they're going to mash up elements of the Terminator, Matrix and Transformers into something that might charitably be said to have its moments. It was directed by Asylum staple Lee Scott. I think this was his 10th movie for the studio, and he's generally pretty good at the nuts and bolts and better than average at hiding just how cheap everything is. Let's have a look at the plot. This is one of those slippery Asylum films that's quite hard to summarise in a way that accurately conveys the experience of watching the film. On one level, the film is very straightforward to summarise. In a post-apocalyptic world at the mercy of cruel robot overlords, a team of soldiers try to capture a robot so they can build a device that will destroy the whole invasion force. The actual reality of watching Transmorphers is to be in a state of mild but near perpetual confusion. It's a bit like being in a complicated meeting with a bad hangover. It's very hard to keep track of what's actually going on, and you've already forgotten everyone's name, and there's the small possibility you're going to be sick. We open with a prologue that establishes the status quo. In 2009, the human race made contact with an alien race, and in return, they sent a fleet of 12-sided dice to destroy the world. Any role player will tell you that you cannot trust a 12-sided dice. There's something off about them. They are very much the red-headed stepchildren of the polyhedral world. These 12-sided dice are even worse than usual because they're full of lasers, and we get a little classic Asylum destruction, i.e. some very brief drone footage of a random city with explosions crudely pasted over the top. The world as we know it ends and is taken over by killer robots who hide the sun and make it so that it never stops raining, because apparently they've invaded from Manchester. Humanity is reduced to living underground. It is all very Terminator. After some credits, we get a brief external shot of an underground city, and then we're into the meat of the film. It's 100 years in the future, and we're going to be meeting a lot of people who will be arguing in 3 slightly different underground rooms. This film has a large and confusing cast, and considers flagging who is actually going to be important later to be rank cowardice of the second worst kind. The very worst kind of rank cowardice is showing people anything that could be more easily described. This combines to make things really quite hard to follow, especially in the first and much worse half of the film. It doesn't help that pretty much everyone we meet in the opening is going to turn out to be dead very shortly, so trying to learn their names is like naming the contents of a box of chicken nuggets 5 minutes before dinner time. One character who does matter is the General. She's weirdly young and hot for senior management, but I guess 1, life expectancy is lower when you're living underground, and 2, maybe access to really good beauty products is an essential part of keeping the dream of civilization alive. The robot activity has been getting closer and closer to the human city, so the hot general sends a bunch of soldiers out onto the surface to bring back a robot. It seems the boffins have hatched a plan to destroy the entire robot force by broadcasting a shutdown code, but they need components from an actual robot to make this possible. The soldiers bicker for a bit in a way that's very, very reminiscent of a key scene in Aliens, and then head up to the surface, which is here being portrayed by a partially demolished factory in the pissing rain. It looks a lot like a wet Wednesday in Luton, and that makes it as post-apocalyptic as post-apocalyptic gets. The soldiers try and organise an ambush on a patrol, but it all goes wrong when a random bit of masonry transforms, or transmorphs if you prefer, into a very large robot covered in guns. Someone goes into convulsions, and it turns out the robots can brain scan humans to learn their secrets. There's robots everywhere, and they look endearingly rubbish, but I still prefer them to the Michael Bay Transformers, who somehow always just look like clouds of particles rather than anything solid, especially when they transform. Hot General can't afford to send anyone to save the team, so they die alone in the pouring rain. Or at least, that's what I assume. There was some sad music and everyone looked very sombre, but the actual deaths happen off camera. There's nothing like a film that asks you to imagine a key scene because it's too cheap to show it. Anyway, all those characters are dead now and we need to learn a bunch of new characters. With the failure of the mission, the Hot General decides there's only one recourse left, and she puts it to her senior staff. They're going to have to turn to Warren Mitchell, a soldier who was court-martialed for insubordination. Older listeners might remember that Warren Mitchell was also the name of the actor who portrayed Alf Garnett, a horrible, racist, sexist and homophobic old man who was the patriarch of a family in a series of 1960s and 1970s sitcoms. Fortunately, this Warren Mitchell's only real crime was being too awesome and too badass. We get a lengthy scene of the Hot General and her senior officers, who are almost all women, arguing vociferously about whether they should unfreeze a man as dangerously handsome and stylishly unpredictable as Warren Mitchell. It's cool that most of the senior officers are women, but less cool that their main job in this scene is talking up the unfeasible awesomeness of a man. Mitchell is thawed out, and several things become apparent. One is that he's English and from the north, although his accent will migrate considerably from east to west, and vanish almost entirely at moments of extreme tension. The second thing is that when all the senior officers were describing him as dangerous, sexy, and a loose cannon, what they actually meant was that he was unfathomably smug. The thawed Warren Mitchell has a row with the hot general about also thawing out his second-in-command and best mate, Itchy. She agrees, and they have a smaller row about the fact that Mitchell's girlfriend married the hot general after he was frozen. Almost immediately after he was frozen, in fact, which says a lot about the depth of their relationship. Having got his silly monikered chum Itchy thawed, Mitchell's willing to lead a new team on this deadly mission onto the streets of Luton, but it'll have to be on his own extremely smug terms. The hot general agrees, and Mitchell reviews the volunteers. He orders them to punch him and then beats up all of them in a scene that is extremely blurry for reasons I don't understand. I don't know what martial art he's supposed to be doing, but he's putting even less energy into fighting than Steven Seagal does. And if you've ever seen a Steven Seagal movie, you'll know that's no small accolade. Having beaten up the soldiers, Mitchell decides that they're not good enough for the suicide mission and they'll need other, different, better soldiers. And this turns out to be various members of the senior officers team we saw earlier. Most of their names aren't important, as they've all got more or less the same characterisation, in that most of them are performatively angry about everything, which I have to admit seems to be a fairly classic military mindset, so, well done there. Among them, there's Mitchell's ex, which raised the horrible possibility that he's going to manage to win her back from the hot general. Thankfully, he's not going to do that, though he is still going to find a way to be a massive dick about their relationship. The team is now more or less set. There's Mitchell, there's Mitchell's chum Itchy, there's Mitchell's ex, there's a selection of more or less interchangeable angry military ladies with perfect skin and lovely hair. One of them is called Lux, and is faintly cool because she's somehow even angrier and more aggressive than anyone else. His team gets a briefing from a scientist who explains how he can use the fuel cells from a robot to broadcast a signal which will turn them off if they can find a suitably large transmitter. The scientist has also built his own robot, and she looks exactly like a hot 25-year-old woman. I'm impressed with him shamelessly parading his deeply creepy sex bot in front of people without batting an eyelid. They all look at him, and they all think, you've built a sex bot. The scientist also reveals that he built another android before the sex bot, which may or may not be relevant. It's going to be relevant, and it's always the characters you most expect in an Asylum film. Before going off for their next mission, there's just time for various angry military women to have a blazing row about which of them is the most hardcore, which ends in a punch-up that, while still incompetent, is rather better than the fight with Mitchell and the volunteers. There's a background hum of everyone being at each other's throats because of the insurrection 5 years ago that Mitchell led, which would have been a fascinating plotline to explore, except that there's just not enough time. Eventually, the fight is settled by the most hardcore woman beating the shit out of the second most hardcore woman. Having established a pecking order, it seems like everything's now going to be fine. Hot General and Mitchell's ex get a tearful farewell, and now it's time for the actual mission. It's at this point that Transmorphers kicks into something resembling high gear. Not top gear, obviously, but definitely out of first and comfortably into second, and maybe even pushing into third gear at times. It's been something of a struggle up to this point, but having finally decided who the main characters are, things start making more sense, and we enter a portion of the film which will actually try and show the important elements of the plot on screen. Hooray! The team led by Mitchell score a successful ambush on a patrol of robots. They smash a bunch with guns and knock out the last one with a stunner, which will allow the scientist to work on it. Then a bunch of flying robots rock up, and the carefully constructed plan goes straight to hell. There's robots everywhere at this point, and guns are everywhere, and everything is very confusing in a way that is kind of like a real battle. It's also still dark and rainy, which doesn't help the heroes, but absolutely makes the action look a lot better. The robots are transmorphing themselves into new attack forms all over the place, which is pretty neat, although every form does just look like a lump covered in guns, which then sort of morphs into another lump covered with guns. Soldiers die, and in the ensuing chaos, Mitchell's X gets grabbed by a flying robot. Another soldier called Blair grabs a discarded robot jetpack and goes after her. The dust settles, and there's good and bad news. The good news is Blair manages to catch up to Mitchell's X and take out the robot carrying her. The bad news is literally everything else. Mitchell's X and Blair are now stranded far from home. The scientist only has 4 minutes to extract the power core before more robots find them. Someone got brain scanned, so now robots know their entire plan. And it turns out that some of the robots are partly made of meat, which makes extracting the power supply even more tricky. There's no way this is getting done in 4 minutes. Mitchell sends everyone back to the city with the meaty robot, while he and one of the more angry soldier ladies cover their retreat. This bit is approaching actually being good as they try to buy the rest time. Back in the city, the scientist keeps working. The Hot General is a bit miffed to discover that Mitchell has essentially handed the robots, both meaty and vanilla, the location of the city. A huge force of robots is moving to encircle them. Mitchell argues that this would have happened anyway, and at least this way they have a chance of doing the big plan. Hot General grudgingly agrees and establishes her own badass soldier credentials by refusing to let Mitchell go out in search of her wife. Things begin to move fast at this point. The scientist can't keep the meaty robot's power supply active for long enough for it to be useful unless it's transported inside another robot. Mitchell suggests the sex bot, but the scientist reveals that actually Mitchell is a robot, in a twist sure to shock anyone without a fully developed concept of object permanence. Mitchell says he's always known, presumably on the basis that he can spot the implication of not having been to the toilet once in his entire life. Mitchell puts the power supply up himself in some fashion, and it's agreed that half the cast will try and get to a transmission tower, while the other half does a desperate last stand against the robot encirclement. Mitchell heads off to the transmission tower with his team, which is luckily exactly where his ex and Blair are. They meet up with his ex and Blair. There's a moment where it seems like his ex might have been shot, but then she just steps out from behind a pillar and it turns out that she wasn't at all. And it's really not clear exactly what did happen. The team break into the transmission tower and engage in a little firefight with robots inside. At this point, it turns out that the entire transmission tower is a Transmorpher, and it slowly and artlessly turns into a massive robot like Metroplex out of Transformers, but much, much worse. It arguably looks even worse than watching your cousin awkwardly transform the actual Metroplex toy in a living room in 1980s Blackpool, which is not a memory I thought would ever be useful to me in a podcast, but hey, I'll take it. We get the big battle, there's dogfights, there's laser beams, there's lots of robots, and the various angry soldiers have settled their difference and now they've got each other's backs. And it all looks pretty good by Asylum standards. I can see what's going on, and there's plenty of variety to the shots rather than 3 almost identical shots being repeated until you lose the will to live. Mitchell reveals that he can get through the robot security system because it only targets organic matter, and he's a robot. He gets to the centre of the transmission tower come massive robot, and at the last possible second manages to sacrifice himself and send the transmission, which turns off all of the robots by essentially turning the tower into some kind of universal remote control. He finds the time before doing this to try and ruin his ex and the Hot General's relationship by telling his ex that he still loves her, which is exactly the sort of thing you should keep to yourself. Maybe don't spend your last ever conversation trying to undermine your ex's relationship when she's already trying to work out if shagging a robot for 10 years counts as bestiality. We finish on Mitchell's ex being reunited with the Hot General, which is something, and on some pleasant scenes of clouds rolling away and the sun coming out for the first time in 100 years. I love that kind of thing. It highlights that so much of the film has been shrouded in darkness. The day is saved, despite the entire war taking place in 3 rooms and a dilapidated industrial space the size of a car park. The end. There are a couple of things to take away from this film. The first is that the sexual politics of Transmorphers are much better than the sexual politics of Michael Bay's output. This is not a big compliment. There's Black Widow spiders with better sexual politics than Michael Bay, but it is worth noting. I do like how many roles in this film are given to women, and it's nice to have a same-sex relationship at the heart of the story. I think there was a much more interesting film buried in here, a film that basically ignores Warren Mitchell and his muscly chum in favour of focusing on whether the various extremely angry women are going to be able to get along well enough to actually kill some robots. Mitchell is actually an impediment to the best bits of the film. His need to be badass at all times just gets in the way of the more humanly drawn characters. The twist is extremely obvious, not least because it's not the first time we've seen the exact same twist on the podcast. The Terminators would do the exact same twist 2 years later. I actually thought that more of the cast were going to turn out to be robots. There was one woman I thought was some kind of Transmorpher infiltrator, until I realised she just wasn't very good at acting. It's ironic that a film about humans fighting robots would feature so many people who seem like they need AA batteries to function. We got a surprisingly good cast in the last episode with multiple actors that you might actually have heard of. Here, it's very much not the case. Amy Webber, who plays Mitchell's ex, is probably the closest thing to an actual celebrity, given that she'd been in WWE as John Bradshaw Layfield's valet for almost 12 months in 2004. So, real A-lister. She left citing harassment as a primary motivation, which seems pretty standard for the wrestling industry, and she is one of the better performers here, but it's really not saying much. When this is the high watermark for notability, you know that this is a production bereft of star power even by Asylum standards. The next most notable actor is Griff First, and he's best known as the son of a guy who had a supporting role on Babylon 5. That's the quality of star we're dealing with here. Griff First would actually direct a couple of films for the Asylum later in his career. Our noble hero, Warren Mitchell, is played by Matthew Wolfe. He's mostly a voice actor who has provided a lot of additional voices for video games. In theory, this means he's good at accents, which makes the nebulously northern one he's picked for Mitchell even more baffling. He's really not very good, but I do think the script is also trying to set him up for failure. Being introduced by a room full of people arguing about exactly how much of a handsome and dangerous loose cannon you are sets a standard that's impossible to hit for anyone except Keanu Reeves. The General is played by Eliza Swenson, who pulled double duty by composing some of the music for the film as well. She's the frontwoman for a pretty good gothic rock band called The Divine Madness, albeit one that doesn't have its own Wikipedia page. And she's done music for a whole bunch of films. And she's a better musician than she is an actor, but she does her best. The cast are definitely not a strength here, and I think a couple of cheap but experienced B-movie hands would have gone a long way in upping the ambient level of acting talent. Having economised on the cast does leave a chunk of unexpected cash on hand for visual effects. It would be overkill to say that the effects are good, but there's been more of an attempt than usual to get things on the screen, especially in the second half of the film. The director does his absolute best to hide the fact that they're shooting in a very tight location, something which Lee Scott does seem to be really good at. The darkness and the rain lend a degree of moody atmosphere that I appreciated, and, as I said earlier, they're very handy for covering up the worst elements of the shoddy CGI. One thing I loved was that the effects team can sort of do a transformation effect, but it always looks like one broadly geometric shape turning into another broadly geometric shape with a gun sticking out of it. The closest we get to robots in disguise is a massive robot disguising itself as a lump of masonry. It would be the absolute saddest transformer in the world, except for the fact that the GoBots, everyone's favourite Transformers knockoff, had a line of toys called Rock Lords, which were robots that turned into rocks and boulders for reasons that even a 1986 animated movie couldn't accurately explain. I particularly enjoyed the transmission tower turning into a giant robot on screen, but somehow managing to not show any of the actual transformation. That's Olympic levels of chicanery and misdirection. Turns out transformation sequences are quite hard, and it's much easier to just gradually show more and more of a robot. Most of the battle scenes involve people wearing swimming goggles, firing obviously pretend guns at bad CGI robots that are off screen, but I'm sufficiently hardwired to find giant robots cool that even the Asylum can't quite manage to ruin them despite their best efforts. There is an energy to the battles thanks to lots of laser effects and people running about and a healthy selection of squibs. And the scenes where you do get to see big robots looming over the human cast, albeit briefly, have something of an impact, at least for me. I think this deep into the project, the Asylum have lowered my expectations to such a dramatic extent that simply showing me the thing the movie is about feels like an actual treat. I've got to the point where if I watched an Asylum movie called The Man in a Hat, and he actually put on a hat at any point in the runtime, I'd probably stand up and applaud the screen. The bar is now so low that earthworms can clear it with ease. I think the decision to make the giant robots the antagonists is basically a good one. By making the robots the villains, you get the cool visuals, but you don't end up with the problem whereby it feels like the humans are wasting time that could be better spent on the central conflict between different robot factions. The humans in Transformers stories always wind up feeling like the awkward guy at the orgy. No one actually invited them. They aren't really adding anything to the experience, but it would be churlish to just ask them to leave. They aren't doing anything wrong, it's just when you planned this orgy it had a distinct atmosphere and this guy's vibes are harshing the buzz. At least Transmorphers doesn't have that problem. Can't harsh a buzz that doesn't exist in the first place. It's a game of two halves for me. The first half is weaker by a considerable margin. The old Asylum technique of having a weirdly large cast isn't hiding the fact that the structure is really muddled, the characters are unclear, and the supposed hero has the charisma of those coconut flavour Quality Street that are always the last ones left in the tin. It comes together better in the second half. It attempts to actually show things and the battles more or less work. The stakes are much clearer and there is actual stuff for everyone to do. I could have done without Warren Mitchell, the most amazing badass who ever lived, but I appreciate the queer overtones a great deal, and overall it finishes feeling more like an actually functional film than some Asylum features. There's actually a prequel and sequel to Transmorphers, which suggests that it did fairly well by Asylum standards. Well enough that they wanted to return to the well at any rate. And we'll get to those at some point. Next time on the podcast, I think we need to do something a bit more modern. It's time to watch Dracula, the original living vampire, a mockbuster of Morbius, the living vampire. Well, that's right, it's morbing time. Maybe I'll even watch Morbius as well. May God have mercy on my soul. If you're enjoying this podcast, why not consider chucking me a quid or two on Patreon to support my nonsense? It'd soften the blow of having to watch Jared Leto considerably. All donations help keep the podcast on the air and ad-free, and I'm grateful to everyone who's already signed up. It means a great deal. Patreon.com/HJDoom is the place to go, and everyone gets a bunch of adventure game books written by members of the Doom household by way of a reward. If you want to get in touch with me, you can do so by emailing me at hjdoomretrofun, all one word, @gmail.com, or by following me on Blue Sky. Thanks very much for listening, take care, and I'll see you soon.